Unexplained Native American mysteries continue to surface, revealing chilling accounts of vanished settlements, cursed landscapes, and artifacts beyond explanation. Eyewitness reports describe strange lights, voices, and movements across sacred ground. Each discovery deepens unease, suggesting something ancient still lingers beneath forgotten places, waiting, watching, and resisting understanding at all. Itself. In the mist-laced valleys of the southern Appalachian Mountains, where limestone ridges rise like worn stone ribs beneath shifting fog, there are places that seem to hold on to the past differently. Moss clings to ancient rock formations. Narrow streams cut through dense forest in patterns that have likely existed for thousands of years. It is here, across what is now western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and northern Georgia, that oral traditions of the Cherokee speak of beings sometimes referred to as the moon-eyed people. In Cherokee accounts recorded by early European settlers and later anthropologists, these figures are described as small, pale, and distinct from neighboring indigenous groups. The most striking detail, repeated across versions of the story, is their sensitivity to daylight. They were said to see poorly in the sun, but clearly at night, under the light of the moon. This characteristic gave rise to the name by which they are remembered. According to tradition, these people were already present in the region before the Cherokee themselves arrived. Some accounts suggest they lived in stone structures, unlike the more temporary dwellings commonly associated with many indigenous cultures of the region at the time. When the Cherokee expanded into these territories, they reportedly encountered abandoned settlements, quiet, weathered remains of walls and fortifications that did not match their own architectural methods. What happened to the moon-eyed people is where history begins to blur into uncertainty. Some Cherokee oral histories describe a conflict between the two groups. Others suggest a gradual retreat, as if the moon-eyed people avoided direct confrontation and withdrew into more remote and inaccessible areas of the mountains. A few accounts even imply they disappeared entirely, leaving behind only stone remnants and place-based memory. When European settlers arrived centuries later, they noted similar observations. Unusual stone ruins scattered across parts of the Appalachian landscape, often attributed to earlier indigenous construction, though their origins were not always clear. Over time, archaeologists generally interpreted many of these structures as belonging to various native cultures, including ancestral Cherokee communities. Yet the earlier oral distinctions between different groups remained part of the historical record, preserved in fragmented form. One of the more intriguing elements of the moon-eyed people narrative is the way it intersects with broader regional folklore. Stories of pale-skinned, nocturnal beings appear in multiple indigenous traditions across North America, though with differing meanings and contexts. Some scholars suggest these accounts may reflect early encounters with distant populations, while others propose symbolic interpretations, possibly representing memory, seasonal cycles, or spiritual concepts rather than literal beings. Still, there are aspects that resist easy categorization. Certain stone structures in the Appalachian region, such as walls, enclosures, and mound-like formations, have long been the subject of debate. While mainstream archaeology attributes many of these to known indigenous cultures, questions occasionally arise about their diversity in style and construction. Could these variations reflect different groups over time, or entirely separate traditions that have been merged through centuries of interpretation? Oral history does not always align neatly with archaeological classification. It preserves perspective rather than measurement, memory rather than chronology. In Cherokee storytelling tradition, such accounts are not treated as static records, but as living narratives shaped by time, place, and meaning. The moon-eyed people remain within this space between record and interpretation. They are neither fully defined nor fully dismissed. Instead, they exist as a point of convergence, where geology, memory, and story overlap in ways that resist final answers. Modern researchers continue to examine the Appalachian region with new tools, LiDAR mapping, advanced excavation methods, and interdisciplinary studies that combine anthropology with environmental science. Yet even as data accumulates, the oldest questions remain largely unchanged. Who were the Moon-Eyed people, as remembered in Cherokee tradition? Were they a distinct group, a cultural memory, or a symbolic interpretation of earlier encounters now obscured by time? And why do certain landscapes seem to preserve these stories more vividly than others, as if geography itself holds on to fragments of what once passed through it? In the quiet of those mountain valleys, where moonlight still spills across stone and forest in the same patterns described for generations, the story does not conclude. It lingers instead, suspended between what is known and what has yet to be understood. The Appalachian Mountains still hold the memory of stories that resist easy definition, accounts passed through generations, shaped by landscape and silence. As we move westward across time and geography, away from those misted ridges, the narrative shifts into another vast and equally enduring landscape, the high desert mesas of the American Southwest. Here, in northern Arizona, the earth rises into layered plateaus carved by wind and time. The Hopi mesas stand elevated above the desert floor, their stone villages perched at the edge of sky and sand. These settlements are among the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America, where tradition, ceremony, and oral history remain deeply interwoven with daily life. Within this cultural continuity exists a set of teachings often referred to in modern interpretation as the Hopi Blue Star Prophecy. In Hopi tradition, prophecies are not fixed predictions in the modern sense, but layered teachings, ways of understanding cycles of change, balance, and disruption in the world. According to accounts shared by some Hopi elders and later recorded by outside observers, the prophecy speaks of a time when the natural order would be strained, when humanity would drift from harmony with the earth. In these accounts, signs would appear across the world, marking periods of transition. Among these signs, one of the most widely discussed in popular culture is the appearance of a blue star. It is important to note that interpretations of Hopi prophecy vary, and many details circulated in modern media are contested or simplified versions of more complex oral traditions. Within Hopi cultural frameworks, teachings are often symbolic, embedded in metaphor and spiritual instruction, rather than literal forecasting. Yet the idea of the blue star has taken on a life beyond its original cultural context. Some interpretations suggest it represents a celestial event, perhaps a bright star, comet, or astronomical phenomenon visible during a time of global change. Others describe it more abstractly as a symbol of transformation, a marker of transition between worlds or eras of human experience. In mainstream scholarship, caution is often emphasized when discussing such prophecies, particularly because oral traditions can be altered or misunderstood when removed from their cultural setting. At the same time, the persistence of these narratives across generations invites reflection. Why do certain symbolic frameworks appear so consistently across distant cultures? And what does it mean when a prophecy is remembered not as a prediction of specific events, but as a reminder of balance and consequence? Standing on the Hopi mesas at dusk, the desert sky opens with an overwhelming clarity. Stars emerge one by one, unfiltered by urban light. The horizon feels close, as if the sky itself rests just beyond reach. In such a setting, it becomes easier to understand how celestial movement could be woven into cultural memory, not as isolated observation, but as part of a living relationship between land, sky, and time. Some modern interpretations of the Blue Star Prophecy link it to contemporary events or astronomical predictions, though these associations are not supported by Hopi tradition itself. Within the community, emphasis is often placed instead on continuity. on maintaining balance and respect for the natural world, regardless of external interpretation. Still, the prophecy continues to circulate globally, often detached from its original teachings, reinterpreted through lenses of curiosity, uncertainty, or expectation. In doing so, it becomes something else as well, a mirror reflecting how different cultures seek meaning in the sky above them. Whether viewed as symbolic teaching, cultural narrative, or misunderstood folklore, the Blue Star prophecy remains part of a broader question about how knowledge is preserved and transformed over time. What is gained and what is lost when oral traditions move beyond their original context and into global imagination? And as night settles over the mesas, with constellations stretching across the desert sky in patterns unchanged for millennia, the question lingers quietly in the air. Are we witnessing prophecy, interpretation, or simply the enduring human search for meaning written among the stars? As night fades over the Hopi mesas and the desert sky slowly shifts from deep indigo to pale steel blue, the sense of distance between stories begins to dissolve. Across the southwest, landscapes do not feel separated so much as connected by silence, by vast stretches of land where human presence is sparse and sound carries differently. Moving further into this silence, the narrative turns toward the high deserts and canyon lands of northern Arizona and New Mexico, where modern patrol routes overlap with ancient ground. Here, the Navajo Nation spans more than 27,000 square miles, a terrain of mesas, arroyos, and sandstone formations shaped by wind and time. It is one of the largest indigenous territories in North America, and within it, the Navajo Rangers operate as a law enforcement unit responsible not only for public safety, but also for land management, search and rescue, and the protection of culturally significant sites. Their work often takes them into remote areas where roads fade into dirt tracks and where radio signals weaken or vanish entirely. In such places, isolation is not an exception. It is the default condition of the landscape. Among the official duties recorded in public reports, missing persons cases, livestock disputes, and archaeological protection, there exists a quieter layer of narrative. Over time, certain accounts shared by former rangers, local residents, and oral testimonies have entered the broader sphere of regional folklore. These are often referred to informally as unexplained or anomalous encounters, though terminology varies depending on the source. Some reports describe distant lights appearing over canyon rims where no settlements exist. Others mention sudden environmental shifts, temperature drops in enclosed valleys, or the sensation of being observed in places where visibility is otherwise uninterrupted. In more isolated accounts, rangers have spoken of tracking footprints that seem to begin and end without clear origin in sand that should preserve every detail of passage. Official documentation, where it exists, rarely classifies these incidents beyond standard operational notes. Environmental factors, wildlife behavior, atmospheric conditions, and human perception under stress are often cited as possible explanations. And yet, within oral accounts passed between personnel, certain stories persist in a different register, not as confirmed phenomena, but as unresolved experiences. One recurring theme involves navigation. In vast desert regions where landmarks are few and distances deceptive, even experienced personnel can find themselves disoriented. GPS systems may function intermittently. Familiar terrain can appear subtly altered under shifting light. In these moments, some accounts describe encountering structures or formations that were not present on prior visits, stone arrangements, shallow depressions, or pathways that seem newly defined. Geologists and anthropologists would likely attribute many of these perceptions to natural erosion, shadow play, or cognitive mapping errors in featureless terrain. The human brain, when deprived of reference points, often seeks structure where none exists. Yet the persistence of similar descriptions across different individuals and time periods invites a quieter form of curiosity. In Navajo cultural tradition, the land itself is not merely physical space, but a living system of relationships, stories, and spiritual presence. Concepts such as chindi, the remnants of disharmony, or other teachings related to balance and place are sometimes referenced in broader discussions of unexplained experiences, though always with caution regarding interpretation. These frameworks do not necessarily describe the phenomena themselves, but rather provide a way of understanding how humans relate to uncertainty within the landscape. Some former rangers and local guides, speaking in interviews or informal settings, have suggested that certain areas feel different without being able to define why. The language used is often careful, avoiding definitive claims. Instead, it leans toward description, a valley that feels quieter than it should, a canyon where echoes behave unexpectedly, a stretch of road where time feels difficult to estimate. Whether these experiences arise from environmental conditions, psychological factors, or cultural interpretation remains open to discussion. Scientific perspectives emphasize the complexity of perception in extreme environments. Cultural perspectives emphasize the significance of place and memory. Between these frameworks, the accounts remain suspended, neither fully explained nor fully dismissed. As dusk returns over the desert, shadows stretch long across sandstone walls, and the land regains its stillness. Patrol routes continue through the night, following lines drawn across ancient terrain that has witnessed countless generations of passage. Somewhere along those routes, stories continue to form, some recorded, many unrecorded, all filtered through the experience of those who travel alone through vast and quiet spaces. And so the question remains, not as an answer waiting to be solved, but as a presence within the landscape itself. In places so wide and so silent, what exactly is it that is being observed? And what, if anything, is doing the observing? As the desert night deepens over the vast plateaus of the Southwest, the silence of the Navajo lands seems to stretch endlessly, carried forward like a breath between worlds. Moving westward across this continuum of landscapes, the terrain begins to shift once again. Dry mountain ranges give way to the open basin and range country of what is now western Nevada. Here, the land flattens into wide desert expanses, broken by rocky outcrops and ancient lake beds that once held water, where now only dust remains. In this stark environment lies Lovelock Cave, a low limestone cavern tucked into a cliff face overlooking the Humboldt Sink. From the outside, it appears unremarkable, just another hollow in weathered stone, shaped by time and erosion. Yet within its shadows, archaeologists in the early 20th century uncovered one of the most discussed and debated collections of artifacts in the Great Basin region. Lovelock Cave was excavated in 1911 and again in subsequent years, revealing thousands of items preserved in the dry interior, woven duck decoys, nets, baskets, tools, and remnants of daily life attributed to ancient indigenous cultures of the region, often associated with the northern Paiute. The preservation was remarkable, offering a rare glimpse into a long-vanished way of life in the harsh desert environment. But alongside these well-documented findings, another layer of narrative began to circulate, one that would extend far beyond the cave itself. Among early accounts and later retellings, stories emerged of unusually large human remains reportedly discovered within or near the site. These descriptions varied, often passed through oral tradition, newspaper fragments, and anecdotal reports rather than formal archaeological documentation. Some accounts described remains of individuals significantly taller than average populations of the region, with reddish hair or light-colored hair that appeared unusual in context. Mainstream archaeology does not support the existence of a distinct population of giants at Lovelock Cave. The documented excavations, led in part by researchers working with the University of California and local institutions, recorded human remains consistent with known indigenous populations of the Great Basin. Hair color descriptions in older reports are often debated, with explanations ranging from post-mortem environmental changes to misinterpretation or exaggeration in secondary retellings. And yet, the stories persist. In regional folklore and later popular narratives, these alleged red-haired giants became part of a broader tapestry of myth and memory surrounding Lovelock Cave. Some versions describe them as a distinct group that once lived in the area, sometimes in conflict with ancestral Paiute communities. Others frame them as outsiders, travelers, or remnants of a forgotten migration. Still others suggest symbolic interpretations, where the giants may represent cultural memory, metaphor, or misremembered encounters preserved through generations of oral storytelling. Anthropologists and historians approach these accounts with caution, emphasizing the importance of separating archaeological evidence from later mythologization. At the same time, they acknowledge that oral traditions, while not always literal historical records, can preserve meaningful traces of how communities understood their past, their environment, and their encounters with change. The cave itself, dark and cool even under desert heat, seems to hold its own quiet ambiguity. Standing within its narrow passages, where light fades quickly into stone, it is not difficult to understand how layered interpretations could form over time. Places like this do not speak in certainty. They echo instead, reflecting whatever stories are brought into them. Geologically, Lovelock Cave is part of a much older landscape shaped by the prehistoric Lake Lahontan, which once covered large portions of Nevada during the last ice age. As the lake receded thousands of years ago, it left behind caves, sinkholes, and sheltered spaces that became valuable to early human habitation. Within this broader timeline, the artifacts recovered from Lovelock Cave represent only a fragment of a much longer human presence in the region. Still, the more unusual elements of the narrative resist simple closure. Why did stories of giants become attached so strongly to this particular site? Were they influenced by misinterpreted findings, cultural symbolism, or the natural human tendency to enlarge the unknown when details are scarce? Or do they reflect something else entirely? An echo of encounters or memories that have shifted shape as they passed through generations? In the quiet of the desert night, when wind moves across the basin and the cave mouth disappears into shadow, Lovelock Cave becomes more than an archaeological site. It becomes a point of convergence between evidence and imagination, between what has been recorded and what has been remembered differently. And as with so many places in this unfolding landscape of mysteries, the question remains suspended rather than resolved. When stories endure longer than the certainty of their origins, what exactly is it that continues to survive? Fact, interpretation, or something that still waits just beyond the reach of explanation? As the narrative moves away from the dry basins and caves of the Great Basin, the landscape shifts once again, this time northward, into an entirely different world of ice, wind, and endless horizon. The desert silence gives way to something colder, more expansive, where land and sea blur into one another beneath a pale Arctic sky. In the vast regions of Greenland, northern Canada, and Alaska, the Inuit peoples have lived in deep relationship with one of the most extreme environments on Earth for thousands of years. Here, survival is shaped by ice formations that shift with the seasons, by hunting routes carved across frozen seas, and by oral traditions that preserve history in ways both practical and symbolic. Within this tradition exists the figure of the Tornit, sometimes described in Inuit storytelling as a people who lived in the Arctic before the Inuit themselves fully established their presence in certain regions. The accounts vary across communities and generations, but common descriptions portray the Tornit as being physically larger and stronger than the Inuit, yet often more solitary, less socially structured, and in some narratives, more elusive. In some versions of the stories, the Tornit are described as living in large stone or semi-subterranean dwellings, particularly in earlier periods before Inuit architectural styles became dominant in the region. They are sometimes associated with immense strength, capable of feats that seem exaggerated when viewed through a modern lens, such as lifting heavy objects alone or traveling vast distances across harsh terrain with unusual endurance. Mainstream anthropology generally interprets the Tornit not as a separate race of giants, but as a complex figure within Inuit oral tradition. In many scholarly readings, the Tornit may represent earlier cultural groups, mythologized ancestors, or symbolic representations of a transitional period in Arctic history. Archaeological evidence in the Arctic does show successive waves of human migration, including Paleo-Inuit cultures, such as the Dorset people, who preceded the Thule Inuit expansion. Some researchers have suggested that memories of these earlier populations could have been preserved and transformed within oral storytelling over centuries. Yet the Tornit are not simply historical placeholders. In Inuit tradition, they often occupy a liminal space between reality and narrative meaning. In some stories, the Tornit are not portrayed as entirely lost, but as having retreated into remote regions, avoiding contact with later Inuit groups. In others, they are said to have vanished, leaving behind only traces of their presence, abandoned tools, unusual structures, or landscape features whose origins are remembered differently depending on the storyteller. The Arctic environment itself complicates interpretation. Ice can conceal and preserve, then reveal and erase with equal ease. Stone structures built generations ago may shift in appearance as permafrost expands and contracts. In such conditions, distinguishing between cultural memory and environmental transformation becomes an intricate task. Ethnographers who have recorded Inuit oral histories emphasize that these stories are not fixed in the way written records often are. They evolve with each retelling, adapting to context, audience, and purpose. The Tornit, in this sense, may function less as a single historical claim and more as a narrative framework through which relationships between past peoples and present communities are understood. Still, certain details within the accounts continue to draw curiosity. Descriptions of unusually large footprints in snow, or of abandoned dwellings that feel distinct from more familiar Inuit structures, appear in some regional retellings. These are not presented as archaeological confirmations, but as remembered impressions, stories passed down in environments where visual ambiguity is common, and where survival often depends on interpreting subtle signs in the landscape. Modern archaeology has uncovered evidence of long-term habitation across the Arctic, including sophisticated adaptations to extreme cold, seasonal migration patterns, and complex tool-making traditions. Cultures such as the Dorset and Thule demonstrate that human presence in the Arctic is both ancient and diverse. Within this broader timeline, the Tornit may represent a way of remembering those who came before, refracted through the lens of later experience. Yet even with these interpretations, the Tornit remain partly unanchored. They exist in the space between ethnographic record and oral memory, between cultural explanation and lingering ambiguity. As the Arctic wind moves across empty tundra and the light lingers for weeks or disappears entirely depending on the season, the landscape itself seems to resist final definition. It preserves traces, erases others, and transforms what remains into something open to interpretation. And so the question persists, quietly embedded within the frozen horizon. When a culture remembers those who came before in the form of giants, ancestors, or vanished people, what is truly being preserved? The history of those earlier inhabitants, or the deeper human need to give shape to the unknown through story? As the open winds of the Great Plains settle after the shifting river stories of the Otter people, the landscape once again expands into something vast and quiet. Grasslands ripple in slow motion beneath an endless sky, and distant horizons blur where earth and light seem to merge. It is a place where visibility is long, but meaning is often carried in symbols rather than scale. Within this expansive world, among the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples of the Sioux nations, one of the most enduring sacred narratives is the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman, often referred to in English as the White Buffalo Woman. Her story is not tied to a single physical location in the way modern geography defines places, but rather to a remembered moment within the Plains tradition, where the land itself becomes part of the narrative. According to oral tradition, she appeared during a time of hardship and imbalance among the people, when survival and spiritual cohesion were under strain. She is described as appearing in human form, dressed in white buckskin, carrying sacred knowledge and objects. Her arrival is not presented as sudden chaos, but as something quiet and deliberate, an encounter that unfolds in stages, often described with careful attention to behavior, speech, and ritual presence. In these accounts, she is both teacher and messenger, introducing practices that would become central to spiritual life among Plains nations. One of the most widely shared elements of the story is her gift of the sacred pipe, or chanunpa, which is described as a tool of prayer, connection, and relationship, linking individuals, communities, and the natural world in a structured spiritual framework. In this narrative tradition, the pipe is not merely an object, but a living symbol of relational responsibility. After sharing her teachings, the story recounts that she departed in a transformation often described as miraculous or otherworldly. In some versions, she leaves in the form of a white buffalo calf, an event that carries deep symbolic weight given the rarity of white buffalo in nature. White buffalo are extremely uncommon genetic occurrences, making their appearance in Plains ecology both striking and memorable. From a historical and anthropological perspective, the White Buffalo Calf Woman narrative is understood as a foundational spiritual teaching story within Lakota tradition. It encodes ethical principles, ceremonial practices, and relational understandings of the world that extend across generations. Like many oral traditions, it exists simultaneously as history, teaching, and living spiritual presence within the culture that carries it. At the same time, the symbolic density of the story has led to a wide range of interpretations outside its original cultural context. Some view it primarily as allegory, representing renewal, balance, and moral order. Others emphasize its connection to historical cycles of hardship and cultural restoration among Plains communities. The appearance of the white buffalo itself has, in modern times, been interpreted by some as a sign of spiritual significance. While such interpretations vary widely, they reflect the continuing relevance of the symbol within cultural memory, rather than a single fixed meaning. From an ecological standpoint, the Great Plains environment itself plays a subtle role in shaping how such narratives are experienced. Vast open landscapes, seasonal migrations of bison, and the visibility of weather patterns across long distances all contribute to a worldview in which change is both immediate and far-reaching. In such a setting, symbolic encounters tied to animals and natural phenomena become deeply integrated into cultural storytelling. Yet even with historical and ecological framing, the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman resists reduction into a single explanation. It remains layered, part teaching, part memory, part lived spiritual tradition. Its meaning is carried not only in the narrative itself, but in the continued practices and ceremonies that preserve it. And so the question remains, not as something to be solved, but as something to be held in reflection. When a figure appears within a time of imbalance, bringing teachings that reshape spiritual understanding and departing in a form tied to a rare natural phenomenon, is this best understood as symbolic narrative, historical memory, or something that exists in the space where meaning, environment, and belief continue to meet across generations? As the story of White Buffalo Calf Woman settles into the open wind of the plains, the landscape begins to change once again. The grasslands give way to rising mesas, rugged canyons, and sun-baked plateaus carved over immense spans of geological time BC. Shadows grow sharper here, stone replaces soil, and silence takes on a different quality, less empty, more deliberate. This transition leads into the traditional territories of the Apache peoples, spread across regions of what is now the American Southwest, including parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. It is a land defined by extremes: heat and cold, drought and sudden storm, open sky and deep, narrow canyon systems where rock walls hold echoes for long distances. Within Apache oral traditions, there are references to sacred spaces and restricted knowledge tied to caves, places often described in English as forbidden, not as a simple prohibition, but as a reflection of spiritual boundaries and respect for powerful locations within the landscape. These cave narratives are not uniform or centrally defined. Instead, they appear in varied forms across Apache communities, often preserved through oral transmission rather than written record. In some accounts, caves are described as places of emergence, transformation, or contact with powerful spiritual forces. In others, they are spaces that require strict cultural protocols, where entry is limited to those with appropriate knowledge or ceremonial responsibility. From a historical and anthropological perspective, caves in the Southwest have long held significance for indigenous peoples. Archaeological evidence confirms that many cave systems were used for shelter, storage, ceremonial activity, and burial practices across different periods of human habitation. Some caves contain pictographs and petroglyphs, indicating long-term cultural engagement with these environments. Within Apache tradition specifically, caves are often understood as part of a broader sacred geography. The landscape is not viewed as empty terrain, but as a living system where certain locations carry heightened spiritual importance. These places may be associated with origin stories, ancestral presence, or events that shaped cultural memory over generations. Some narratives describe caves as places where boundaries between visible and invisible worlds are thinner, where perception may shift depending on context, preparation, or spiritual state. In such accounts, experiences within caves are not always described in purely physical terms, but as encounters that involve awareness, interpretation, and cultural understanding. At the same time, the physical environment of the Southwest contributes to the formation of powerful spatial impressions. Cave systems in this region can be extensive, with narrow passages, sudden drops, and chambers that alter sound and light dramatically. Even small environmental changes, such as shifting torchlight, airflow, or echo, can significantly affect perception within enclosed stone spaces. From an archaeological standpoint, many cave sites across the broader Southwest have yielded evidence of long-term human presence, including tools, ceremonial objects, and remnants of habitation. These findings suggest that caves were not only practical shelters, but also meaningful locations embedded within cultural and spiritual life. Ethnographic records collected in the 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally reference restrictions or cautions regarding certain sacred sites, including caves. However, these accounts must be understood within their historical context, as they often reflect the perspective of outside observers interpreting indigenous practices through limited frameworks. Within Apache worldview, knowledge of specific places is often closely tied to responsibility. Not all stories are intended for all audiences, and not all locations are meant for general access. In this sense, the idea of forbidden caves is less about mystery in a sensational sense, and more about respect for boundaries between everyday space and sacred space. Modern interpretations sometimes attempt to recast these narratives as legends of hidden chambers or unexplained phenomena. While such readings can be compelling from a popular storytelling perspective, they often overlook the cultural logic that defines these spaces as part of a structured relationship between people, land, and memory. And yet, even through historical and environmental understanding, a sense of depth remains within these landscapes. The canyons and cave systems of the Southwest still hold places that are difficult to access, difficult to see fully, and difficult to describe without acknowledgement of their layered significance. And so the question remains, not as something to be answered, but as something that lingers within the stone itself. When a landscape contains spaces that are physically hidden, culturally restricted, and spiritually significant, are these forbidden caves best understood as archaeological sites, sacred geography, or as part of a broader way in which the Apache tradition recognizes that not all knowledge is meant to be seen at once or by everyone in the same way? As the sun-baked canyons of the Southwest fade behind the Apache cave traditions, the narrative shifts once more, this time moving north and east, toward a landscape defined not by stone walls and desert heat, but by vast inland seas of fresh water. The air cools noticeably. Forests return in dense bands along shorelines, and the horizon breaks into a mosaic of water, islands, and distant tree-covered coasts. This is the region of the Great Lakes, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, one of the largest freshwater systems on Earth. For thousands of years BC, these waters have shaped the lives, travel routes, and spiritual understandings of the indigenous nations who live around them, including Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. Within this vast aquatic world, oral traditions preserve stories of powerful underwater beings often referred to in English as the water panther. In Anishinaabe tradition, this being is commonly known as the Mishipeshu, or Great Lynx, though it is also associated in broader storytelling with panther-like or serpent-like qualities depending on region and interpretation. It is described as a powerful underwater entity associated with deep water, storms, and the dangerous forces of lakes and rivers. Descriptions of the water panther vary, but it is often portrayed as a large, hybrid creature combining features of feline, reptilian, and aquatic forms. In some accounts, it is said to inhabit the deepest parts of lakes, particularly areas where currents are strong, visibility is low, and underwater geography is complex and unpredictable. From a cultural perspective, Mishipeshu is not simply a monster in the modern sense of the word. Within Anishinaabe cosmology, it is part of a structured understanding of natural forces, particularly those connected to water. Water is life-giving, but also powerful and potentially destructive. Storms over the Great Lakes can arise quickly, and the waters themselves can shift from calm to dangerous within moments. In this framework, the water panther is often associated with the more dangerous or unpredictable aspects of these environments: waves, whirlpools, submerged hazards, and sudden storms that appear without warning. Some traditions describe it as a guardian of underwater copper deposits and other natural resources, linking it symbolically to the hidden wealth and danger contained beneath the lakebed. Archaeological and historical evidence confirms that indigenous communities around the Great Lakes maintained extensive trade networks, including the use of native copper from the Lake Superior region. This material was highly valued and widely distributed long before European contact, suggesting a deep historical awareness of the region's underwater resources. Within oral traditions, stories of Mishipeshu are often embedded in moral and spiritual teachings. They emphasize respect for water, caution in navigation, and awareness of the unpredictable nature of large bodies of water. In many narratives, encounters with powerful water beings serve as reminders of balance between human activity and natural forces. From a physical perspective, the Great Lakes themselves are environments where perception can easily shift. Sudden storms can form over open water. Waves can rise rapidly without visible warning from shore. Underwater topography includes deep trenches, hidden currents, and submerged landforms shaped by glacial activity thousands of years BC. These conditions can create experiences that are difficult to interpret in real time, especially from small watercraft. Early European observers of indigenous traditions sometimes recorded accounts of the water panther through their own interpretive frameworks, often emphasizing its more dramatic or fearsome qualities. However, within Anishinaabe understanding, Mishipeshu exists within a broader system of relationships between land, water, spirit, and human responsibility. In some modern interpretations, the water panther has been compared to global mythological lake monsters or aquatic cryptids. While such comparisons can highlight interesting parallels across cultures, they often remove the figure from its specific ecological and spiritual context within Great Lakes indigenous traditions. Even today, the Great Lakes remain environments of immense scale and unpredictability. Beneath the surface, vast volumes of water conceal shipwrecks, geological formations, and ecosystems that are still being studied. Above the surface, weather systems continue to shift rapidly, reminding anyone on the water of its changing nature. And so the question remains, not as something to be resolved, but as something that continues to move beneath the surface of understanding. When a powerful underwater presence is described within a vast inland sea, known for sudden storms, hidden depths, and shifting conditions, is the water panther best understood as a symbolic expression of natural forces, a cultural framework for navigating environmental danger, or a deeper reflection of how human communities have always sought to understand what lies beneath the surface of the waters that sustain them. As the waters of the Great Lakes settle into memory and the presence of the water panther fades beneath deep freshwater currents, the narrative shifts once more. This time, the journey moves southward and slightly eastward, away from vast inland seas and toward the rising Appalachian landscape, where rivers cut through ancient stone and mist gathers in the hollows between forested ridges. This is the traditional homeland of the Cherokee people, a region that spans parts of what is now western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and surrounding areas. It is a landscape defined by layered geography, mountain peaks, dense forests, river valleys, and limestone formations shaped over immense spans of time BC. Within this environment, oral traditions preserve complex narratives that describe both the natural world and the spiritual forces believed to move through it. Among these traditions is the figure known as Uktena, often referred to in English as the horned serpent. In Cherokee cosmology, Uktena is described as a powerful and dangerous serpent-like being associated with water, deep places, and hidden realms. It is often portrayed as immense in size, with scales that shimmer or reflect light, and in many accounts, it is said to possess a horn or crystalline growth upon its forehead, sometimes described as a source of great power. Traditional narratives place Uktena in remote and difficult-to-reach environments. Deep river channels, secluded pools, mountain springs, and underground water systems. These are places where visibility is limited, currents are strong, and the landscape itself can shift between calm and forceful states without warning. From a cultural and anthropological perspective, Uktena is part of a broader system of Cherokee spiritual understanding in which animals, natural features, and unseen forces exist in close relationship. Within this framework, powerful beings are often associated with specific elements of the environment: water, stone, wind, or fire, each carrying both creative and destructive potential. In some versions of the tradition, Uktena is described as a being of great danger, encountered only under rare or significant circumstances. In others, it is more complex, existing as part of a balance of forces rather than a purely antagonistic figure. These variations reflect the broader nature of oral storytelling, where meaning can shift depending on context, audience, and purpose. Historically, the Appalachian region itself provides a fitting backdrop for such narratives. The mountains are among the oldest on Earth, their ridges softened by time yet still forming complex networks of valleys, caves, and waterways. Rivers originating in these highlands often travel through narrow, shadowed passages before joining larger systems, creating environments where sudden depth changes, hidden currents, and submerged formations are common. Archaeological evidence confirms long-term Cherokee habitation throughout this region, with settlements closely tied to waterways and fertile valleys. Water sources were central not only to survival, but also to ceremonial and spiritual life. In such a context, stories involving powerful water beings would naturally carry both practical and symbolic significance. From a geological perspective, the region's extensive cave systems and underground water channels add another layer of environmental complexity. Limestone terrain can create hidden passages, sinkholes, and subterranean rivers that are not always visible on the surface. These features contribute to a landscape where what lies beneath is often as significant as what is seen above. Early ethnographic accounts recorded by outside observers occasionally describe Uktena in terms that emphasize its dramatic qualities, sometimes framing it within broader categories of serpent monsters or mythical creatures. However, within Cherokee tradition, such figures are not easily reduced to singular definitions. They exist within a relational worldview in which meaning is tied to place, experience, and spiritual understanding. In some interpretations, the horn of Uktena is associated with great power or sacred knowledge, often guarded or hidden within dangerous contexts. Stories involving attempts to obtain such power frequently carry cautionary themes, emphasizing the consequences of imbalance, overreach, or disrespect toward natural and spiritual boundaries. Even today, the landscapes associated with these traditions remain largely unchanged in their fundamental character. Rivers still carve through stone. Springs still emerge from hidden places. Fog still settles into mountain valleys where sight is limited and sound carries in unexpected ways. And so the question remains, not as something to be resolved, but as something that continues to echo through water and stone. When a powerful serpent-like presence is described within deep rivers and hidden springs, carrying both danger and sacred significance, is it best understood as a symbolic expression of natural forces, a reflection of the physical complexity of Appalachian waterways, or part of a deeper cultural understanding that sees the world's hidden places as inhabited by forces that are not always visible, but are always present within the landscape? As the image of the Uktena horned serpent fades into the shadowed waters of Appalachian rivers, the narrative shifts once more, this time moving outward and northward, away from enclosed valleys and toward an immense, open landscape where the horizon stretches without interruption. The terrain gradually flattens, the forests thin, and the sky seems to expand until it dominates everything beneath it. This is the Northern Plains, a vast expanse covering parts of present-day North and South Dakota, Montana, and neighboring regions. It is a land shaped by wind, migration, and seasonal extremes, where visibility can extend for miles, yet subtle details on the land can still disappear without warning. For thousands of years, BC, this region has been home to numerous indigenous nations, including the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and others, whose histories are deeply connected to movement across these wide-open spaces. Within this environment, oral traditions preserve accounts that modern retellings sometimes refer to as vanishing village legends, stories of entire settlements that seem to disappear, relocate, or become hidden from view under unusual circumstances. These narratives are not uniform, nor are they tied to a single historical event. Instead, they appear in varied forms across different communities and storytelling traditions. In some versions, a village may vanish into mist or be obscured by environmental conditions such as storms or blizzards. In others, the disappearance is more symbolic, involving movement, migration, or transformation rather than literal absence. From a historical perspective, it is well documented that plains communities were highly mobile, following seasonal patterns of migration tied to bison herds, water availability, and ecological cycles. Entire settlements could relocate over relatively short periods, leaving behind temporary structures that might later be reclaimed by the landscape. In such conditions, the vanishing of a village could, in practical terms, reflect movement that is not immediately visible to outside observers. However, within oral storytelling traditions, these events are often described in ways that emphasize perception, atmosphere, and uncertainty. Accounts may describe villages that appear in one location and are later found elsewhere, or settlements that seem to fade from view under specific environmental conditions such as dense fog, snow cover, or shifting light across the plains. The northern plains environment itself contributes to this sense of perceptual ambiguity. Weather systems can change rapidly, transforming clear landscapes into near whiteout conditions within hours. Grasslands, while open, can also be visually deceptive when covered in snow or when light flattens terrain features, making distance and structure difficult to judge accurately. From an anthropological standpoint, such narratives may function on multiple levels. They can preserve historical memory of migration events, encode environmental awareness, and express cultural understandings of movement and change. In some interpretations, the vanishing village is not a supernatural occurrence, but a narrative expression of how mobility and seasonal relocation were experienced from different observational perspectives. At the same time, early written accounts by outside observers occasionally recorded indigenous stories of disappearing settlements without fully capturing their cultural context. This sometimes led to interpretations that emphasized mystery or anomaly rather than the underlying patterns of movement and environmental adaptation that shaped life on the plains. Archaeological evidence supports the long history of dynamic settlement patterns in the region, including earth lodges, teepees, and other structures designed for mobility or seasonal use. Many of these forms leave limited permanent traces, especially when materials are organic and designed to be dismantled or moved. Yet even with historical and environmental explanations, the narrative structure of vanishing villages persists in oral tradition, suggesting that these stories carry meaning beyond simple physical relocation. They reflect a way of understanding space in which presence and absence are not always fixed states, but conditions influenced by time, perception, and context. And so the question remains, not as something to be resolved, but as something that lingers across the open wind of the plains. When entire communities are described as vanishing into landscape, mist, or distance, is this best understood solely as a reflection of migration and environmental visibility, or does it also speak to a deeper cultural awareness of how movement, memory, and perception can reshape the way presence itself is experienced across an immense and shifting land? As the wide, windswept expanse of the northern plains begins to fade behind us, the narrative turns once again toward water, toward a coastline where forested islands, cold currents, and deep marine channels replace the open horizon. The transition is subtle but distinct, as if the land itself is narrowing its focus from endless grassland to intricate waterways. This is the Salish Sea, a complex network of coastal channels, inlets, and straits stretching between present-day Washington State and British Columbia. It is a place defined by tides and fog, where dense evergreen forests descend directly into salt water, and where weather can shift quickly, cloaking islands and shorelines in shifting layers of mist. For thousands of years, this region has been home to Coast Salish peoples and other indigenous nations whose lives have been deeply connected to the rhythms of the sea. Canoes, carefully crafted from cedar, have long been central to travel, trade, fishing, and ceremonial life. These vessels were not only practical tools, but also cultural expressions, shaped with knowledge passed through generations. Within this maritime landscape, oral traditions have preserved accounts that modern listeners often refer to as the ghost canoes of the Salish Sea. These stories do not describe ghosts in the conventional sense of human spirits tied to physical forms, but rather unexplained sightings of canoes appearing under unusual conditions, often in fog, twilight, or during sudden weather changes. In some accounts, paddlers are seen moving silently across the water, only to vanish moments later. In others, empty canoes are observed drifting without visible occupants, maintaining a steady course before disappearing into mist or distance. The Salish Sea itself is a challenging environment for perception. Its waters are layered with shifting currents, tidal exchanges, and complex island geography. Fog is frequent, especially during seasonal transitions, and visibility can change within moments. Sound behaves unpredictably over water, sometimes carrying voices or movement farther than expected, or distorting direction entirely. Mainstream explanations for ghost canoe sightings often begin with these environmental conditions. Fog banks can obscure distance and depth, creating visual ambiguities where small boats appear and disappear quickly. Reflections on water surfaces can distort perception, and wave patterns may create the impression of movement where none exists. In low-light conditions, particularly at dawn or dusk, human vision can misinterpret shapes and motion across uneven surfaces. Yet, within indigenous oral traditions, these experiences are not always framed as errors of perception. Instead, they are often understood within a broader worldview in which the natural and spiritual dimensions of the world are not strictly separate. The sea is not merely a physical body of water, but a living system of relationships, memory, and presence. In some accounts shared within Coast Salish storytelling traditions, canoes may be associated with ancestral travel or spiritual passage. These narratives are often deeply contextual, tied to specific places, teachings, and ceremonial understanding. They are not typically presented as generalized phenomena, but as experiences embedded within cultural frameworks that require careful interpretation. Because of this, external references to ghost canoes often simplify or detach elements of these traditions from their original context. What may appear in popular retellings as mysterious or unexplained sightings can, within indigenous perspectives, carry meanings related to memory, ancestry, or the layered relationship between land, water, and people. Historically, canoes were essential to life across the Salish Sea. Large ocean-going cedar canoes could carry entire families or trading groups across long distances, connecting coastal communities through extensive networks of travel and exchange. Archaeological and ethnographic records confirm the sophistication of canoe-building techniques, including precise carving methods and deep knowledge of wood selection and hydrodynamics. In this context, it is not surprising that canoes also occupy a symbolic space within storytelling traditions. When a vessel is so central to movement, survival, and connection across water, it naturally becomes more than a tool. It becomes a cultural presence in its own right. Some modern interpretations of ghost canoe accounts have attempted to link them to maritime folklore found in other parts of the world, where ships or vessels are said to appear under unusual atmospheric conditions. While comparative mythology can reveal interesting parallels, it is important to recognize the distinct cultural and environmental contexts in which these Salish Sea narratives exist. There are also historical records from early European explorers and settlers in the region that describe unusual sightings on the water, distant canoes that seemed to move without visible propulsion, or vessels that disappeared into fog banks without trace. However, these accounts are often brief, filtered through unfamiliarity with local navigation practices and environmental conditions. From a scientific perspective, many of these observations can be understood through known phenomena. The Salish Sea is subject to complex tidal systems, with strong currents that can quickly carry small vessels out of sight. Fog formation can be dense and uneven, creating pockets of visibility that shift rapidly. Light reflection on water, combined with atmospheric moisture, can produce optical illusions that affect depth perception and motion tracking. Psychological factors may also play a role. In environments where visibility is limited and conditions change rapidly, the human brain relies heavily on pattern recognition and expectation. In such settings, ambiguous shapes can be interpreted as familiar forms, such as boats or figures, even when details are incomplete or misleading. Yet even with these explanations, the persistence of ghost canoe narratives continues to invite curiosity. Why do similar descriptions emerge across different times and observers? Why do these sightings so often occur at transitional moments, dawn, dusk, fog, or storm, when boundaries between visibility and obscurity are at their most fluid? Within indigenous frameworks, such questions are not necessarily viewed as problems to be solved, but as part of an ongoing relationship with place. The water is not passive. It is active, responsive, and layered with meaning. What is seen upon it may depend not only on physical conditions, but also on the context of observation and understanding. The Salish Sea itself holds deep time within its waters. It has witnessed millennia of human presence, seasonal migrations of fish and people, and countless journeys by canoe across its channels. Beneath its surface lie submerged forests, archaeological sites, and geological formations shaped by glacial retreat thousands of years BC. Standing on its shore today, one can still observe how quickly it changes. A clear horizon can dissolve into fog within minutes. An island can vanish from sight as weather rolls in. Sound can carry across water in ways that are difficult to locate precisely. In such an environment, certainty becomes fluid, and perception is always partial. And so the question remains, not as a conclusion, but as an open horizon stretching across water and mist. When a canoe appears and disappears within the shifting boundary of fog and tide, is it simply a trick of light and environment? A reflection of human perception under uncertain conditions? Or does it also reflect something deeper about how movement, memory, and presence are experienced in a landscape where water itself never remains still? As the fog over the Salish Sea slowly thins and the last traces of shifting water and drifting silence fade into memory, the journey turns inland once more. The coastline recedes, replaced by rising terrain, rolling foothills that gradually fold into the dense green wall of the southern Appalachian Mountains. It is a landscape that feels familiar in its continuity with earlier sections of this exploration, yet distinctly different in atmosphere. Here, the air is heavier with vegetation, the light more filtered, and the horizon broken by layers of forested ridges rather than open water or sky. Within this region, spanning parts of present-day North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia, Cherokee oral traditions preserve accounts of beings known as the Nunnehi, often translated as the hidden people. Unlike many figures that appear in mythological frameworks as distant or abstract, the Nunnehi are described in Cherokee tradition as deeply embedded within the landscape itself. They are not portrayed as gods or distant spirits, but as a parallel people, existing in close proximity to human communities, yet largely unseen under ordinary conditions. In traditional accounts recorded by ethnographers and cultural historians, the Nunnehi are described as living in towns that are invisible or hidden from normal perception, often located within mountains, hills, or remote forested areas. These places are sometimes said to appear only under specific circumstances or to individuals who are in a particular state of awareness or need. Some versions of the stories describe the Nunnehi as resembling humans in appearance, but living apart from ordinary human society. They are often associated with protection, guidance, or intervention during moments of danger. In certain narratives, they are said to assist travelers who are lost in the mountains, or to protect individuals during times of conflict or uncertainty, only to vanish afterward without trace. From a historical and anthropological perspective, these accounts are typically understood as part of a broader Cherokee cosmological framework in which the world is populated by multiple layers of existence. Within this framework, visibility is not the sole measure of reality. What is unseen is not necessarily absent. Rather, it may exist in a different mode of perception or relationship. The Appalachian Mountains themselves provide a fitting backdrop for such narratives. This is one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, shaped over hundreds of millions of years BC through tectonic activity and erosion. Its terrain is characterized by dense forests, deep valleys, and complex cave systems. Even today, large portions of the region remain sparsely populated, with vast stretches of land that can feel isolated or removed from immediate human presence. In such an environment, it is not difficult to understand how ideas of hidden communities or parallel settlements might emerge. Forest density alone can obscure visibility within a few dozen meters. Mountain ridges can conceal entire valleys from view. Weather patterns, particularly fog and sudden storms, can dramatically alter perception of space and distance. In these conditions, the line between known and unknown terrain becomes fluid. Mainstream interpretations of Nunnehi traditions often emphasize their symbolic and cultural functions. In some readings, they represent ideals of balance, community, and ethical behavior, embodying the concept that proper conduct aligns individuals with harmony in both social and natural worlds. In others, they are seen as narrative expressions of resilience, particularly during periods of displacement or conflict, when the idea of hidden allies or unseen protectors may have offered psychological or cultural support. At the same time, certain oral accounts preserve more ambiguous elements. Stories sometimes describe encounters in which individuals hear sounds of distant communities, drumming, voices, or movement, only to find no visible source upon approach. In other narratives, travelers report finding evidence of habitation such as pathways, structures, or signs of recent activity that later appear altered or absent when revisited. From a scientific standpoint, these experiences can often be examined through environmental and perceptual factors. The Appalachian region is known for its acoustic variability. Sound can travel unpredictably through valleys and ridges, sometimes creating the impression of proximity where the source is distant or obscured. Light conditions in forested environments can shift rapidly, particularly under canopy cover, leading to visual misinterpretation of depth and movement. Psychological factors may also contribute to such perceptions. In environments characterized by isolation, dense terrain, and limited reference points, the human mind tends to construct patterns to interpret incomplete sensory input. This is not a flaw in perception, but rather a fundamental aspect of how humans navigate complex environments. However, within Cherokee cultural understanding, such experiences are not always reduced to perceptual error. The Nunnehi are part of a worldview in which multiple forms of existence coexist within the same landscape. The visible and invisible are not strictly separate domains, but interconnected layers of reality that may overlap under certain conditions. In some traditional interpretations, the Nunnehi are also associated with moral instruction. Stories involving these hidden people often carry themes of respect for the land, proper behavior in the forest, and the consequences of imbalance or disrespect. Their appearances are not random, but meaningful within narrative context, often occurring during moments of crisis, transition, or moral decision. Over time, as these stories were recorded by outside observers, they were sometimes reframed within broader categories of folklore or myth. In doing so, certain nuances were lost, particularly those relating to cultural protocols and the contextual nature of storytelling. Within Cherokee tradition, stories are not static records, but living narratives shaped by circumstance, audience, and intention. This distinction is important when considering the Nunnehi, because their significance lies not only in what is described, but in how those descriptions function within a cultural system. They are part of a relational understanding of the world, one in which land, memory, and presence are deeply intertwined. Even today, the Appalachian landscape continues to hold this sense of layered presence. Dense forest can obscure entire ridges. Valleys can feel enclosed in ways that alter perception of distance and time. Walking through these environments, it is easy to become aware of how much remains unseen, even in places that are well mapped and frequently traveled. And so the question remains, not as something to be resolved, but as something that continues to exist within the landscape itself. When stories describe a people who live just beyond ordinary perception, appearing only under certain conditions and disappearing without trace, are they speaking of separate beings hidden within the land? Or are they reflecting a deeper understanding of how reality itself may contain layers that are not always visible at once, even when occupying the same space? As the Appalachian Mountains begin to soften into memory, and the idea of hidden people lingers in the forested shadows, the narrative turns once more toward the far edge of the continent. Westward again, across mountain ranges and river systems, the land eventually breaks open into another vast coastal world, one shaped by rain, cedar forests, and a coastline carved by ancient ice. This is the Pacific Northwest, where dense evergreen forests meet cold ocean inlets, and where mist often hangs between land and sea like a shifting veil. Here, along the coasts of present-day British Columbia, Washington, and parts of Alaska, water is not just a boundary, it is a network of movement. Fjords, straits, and sheltered channels form natural highways that indigenous nations have navigated for thousands of years using finely crafted cedar canoes. Within this maritime landscape, oral traditions from several coastal communities contain references that modern listeners sometimes describe as flying canoes. These accounts do not typically describe literal flight in a modern technological sense, but rather unusual or unexplained canoe sightings in the air, above water, or moving in ways that seem to defy ordinary expectation. In many versions, the canoes appear briefly, silhouetted against fog or mist, before vanishing without trace. In others, they are seen elevated above the waterline, or perceived in conditions where distance and visibility are difficult to judge. To understand these narratives, it is essential first to understand the environment in which they arise. The Pacific Northwest coastline is one of the most complex marine landscapes in the world. The Salish Sea, the Inside Passage, and countless smaller channels are shaped by tides, wind currents, and rapid weather shifts. Fog is frequent, especially during seasonal transitions, and can reduce visibility dramatically within moments. Light behaves unpredictably across water surfaces, particularly when reflecting off ripples, waves, and wet rock faces. In such an environment, perception is constantly negotiated between clarity and obscurity. From a historical standpoint, indigenous nations of the region, including Coast Salish, Haida, Tlingit, and Nuu-chah-nulth peoples, developed highly advanced canoe technologies adapted precisely to these waters. Large ocean-going canoes carved from cedar trees were capable of carrying entire families or ceremonial groups across long distances. These vessels were designed for stability, speed, and endurance, and were central not only to transportation, but also to cultural and social life. Early European explorers and traders in the region recorded numerous observations of indigenous canoe travel, often expressing surprise at the scale, skill, and coordination involved. Some accounts describe large fleets of canoes moving across water in formations that, under certain lighting conditions, could appear visually striking or even disorienting to unfamiliar observers. It is within this intersection of environment, technology, and perception that later interpretations of flying canoes begin to emerge. In some oral traditions and regional stories, canoe sightings that defy easy explanation are often associated with fog banks, dusk lighting, or sudden atmospheric changes. A canoe partially obscured by mist may appear to float above the waterline. A distant vessel moving along a wave crest might seem suspended when viewed from a lower angle. Reflections on calm water can create doubled or distorted images, giving the impression of elevation or separation from the surface. Modern scientific explanations often point to these optical and atmospheric conditions as sufficient to account for such sightings. Refraction of light through layers of humid air, combined with the reflective properties of water and the low-angle lighting common in coastal environments, can produce visual effects that challenge spatial interpretation. The human brain, attempting to resolve incomplete information, may fill gaps in perception with familiar forms, such as the recognizable silhouette of a canoe. Yet, as with many narratives tied to place-based oral tradition, there are layers that extend beyond purely environmental explanation. Within indigenous worldviews of the Pacific Northwest, canoes are not only physical vessels, but also culturally significant entities embedded within systems of knowledge, relationship, and ceremony. Movement across water is often understood in relational terms, connecting communities, ancestors, and territories in ways that are both practical and symbolic. In some interpretations shared within cultural contexts, unusual canoe sightings may be understood as experiences shaped by perception, memory, or spiritual awareness. These interpretations are not framed as anomalies to be resolved, but as part of a broader understanding of how the world is experienced through multiple layers of meaning. It is important to note that these narratives vary widely between nations and communities, and many are not publicly shared in detail due to cultural protocols surrounding knowledge and storytelling. What is known in broader circulation is often fragmented, filtered through historical records, traveler accounts, and later interpretations that may not fully reflect their original context. Even so, the persistence of similar motifs across coastal regions has drawn attention from researchers studying comparative folklore and environmental perception. The idea of vessels appearing and disappearing in liminal conditions, fog, twilight, storm edges, appears in multiple maritime cultures worldwide. Whether these similarities reflect shared environmental conditions or deeper patterns in human perception remains an open question. The Pacific Northwest itself continues to reinforce the plausibility of ambiguity. Weather systems move rapidly through coastal channels. Islands appear and disappear behind shifting fog. Sound travels unpredictably over water, sometimes seeming closer or more distant than its source. In such a setting, certainty is always provisional. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence confirms that canoe travel has been continuous in this region for thousands of years, BC, forming one of the most sophisticated maritime cultures in the ancient world. Yet archaeology, focused on material remains, cannot fully capture the experiential dimension of travel across water, how distance feels when surrounded by fog, or how movement is perceived when horizon and surface merge. It is within that experiential space that stories of flying canoes continue to exist, not as fixed claims, but as narratives shaped by environment, memory, and interpretation. And so the question remains, suspended like mist over coastal water. When a canoe appears to rise above the surface or vanish into shifting air, is it simply the result of light, distance, and atmosphere interacting in a complex coastal environment? Or does it also reveal something deeper about how movement, perception, and meaning are intertwined in a landscape where water, sky, and land are never fully separate from one another? As the mist of the Pacific Northwest lingers in memory, those shifting waters where canoes seem to hover between fog and reflection, the narrative turns once more inland and northward. The coastline dissolves into vast boreal forest, where the air grows colder, heavier with pine and silence. Rivers widen into slow-moving systems that carve through endless green, and the land begins to feel less like a collection of places and more like a continuous, living expanse. This is the traditional territory of the Cree, one of the largest indigenous groups in North America, whose ancestral lands stretch across what is now parts of Canada, from the woodlands of Quebec and Ontario into the vast subarctic regions of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and beyond. It is a land defined by seasonal movement, where survival historically depended on close observation of animal patterns, weather shifts, and the subtle rhythms of the forest. Within this cultural and geographical landscape, there are modern oral accounts and contemporary folklore references, particularly in online retellings and regional storytelling, that describe encounters with beings often referred to as black-eyed spirits. It is important to note from the outset that these accounts are not part of documented traditional Cree cosmology in any consistent or verified historical form. Rather, they exist at the intersection of modern folklore, internet-era storytelling, and loosely connected interpretations of indigenous narrative themes. Still, they persist in circulation, often attached to indigenous settings regardless of origin, and are frequently discussed in broader paranormal discourse. Descriptions of these black-eyed spirits tend to follow a similar pattern across retellings. They are said to appear in remote areas, along forest trails, near isolated roads, or at the edges of human habitation. Their presence is often marked not by dramatic action, but by subtle unease, a feeling of being watched, an unusual silence in the surrounding environment, or an encounter with figures whose behavior seems slightly out of place within ordinary social expectations. The most commonly repeated detail is, as the name suggests, their eyes. In these accounts, the eyes are described as entirely dark, lacking visible iris or sclera, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. This singular detail has become the defining feature in most modern interpretations of the phenomenon. From a scientific and psychological perspective, there are several known factors that could contribute to such perceptions. Low light conditions in forested environments can significantly alter visual interpretation. Shadows, headlight glare, fatigue, and distance can all distort the appearance of eyes, making them seem uniformly dark or absent of detail. Cognitive psychology also notes that the human brain is highly sensitive to facial recognition cues. When expected details are missing or obscured, the mind may interpret ambiguity in ways that feel unsettling or unfamiliar. In northern forest environments, where light levels can be low for extended periods of the year and where dense canopy cover limits visibility even during daylight hours, such perceptual distortions are not uncommon. The Cree territories themselves include vast boreal regions where human encounters are relatively infrequent and where natural silence can amplify awareness of even minor irregularities in movement or sound. Yet the persistence of these stories raises broader questions about how modern folklore forms and spreads. Unlike traditional oral histories, which are rooted in specific cultural frameworks, many contemporary accounts of black-eyed spirits circulate in digital spaces where narratives are rapidly shared, adapted, and merged with unrelated traditions. In this process, cultural boundaries are often blurred, and motifs become detached from their original contexts. Within verified Cree cosmology, spiritual beings and narratives do exist, as they do in many indigenous knowledge systems. These are often deeply embedded in teachings about respect for the land, relationships with animals, and the balance between human and natural worlds. However, the specific motif of uniformly black-eyed entities does not appear as a consistent or recognized element within established Cree traditional teachings as documented by anthropologists or cultural historians. This distinction is important because it highlights how easily modern storytelling can overlay new interpretations onto existing cultural landscapes. What emerges is not always a continuation of tradition, but sometimes a hybrid narrative shaped by external influences, media repetition, and generalized associations with remote wilderness settings. Still, even when separated from verified tradition, the imagery persists. Why do such descriptions take hold so readily in narratives associated with forests, isolation, and indigenous territories? Part of the answer may lie in the symbolic power of eyes themselves as indicators of presence, identity, and recognition. In environments where visibility is limited and human contact is rare, the absence or distortion of familiar facial cues can produce a heightened sense of uncertainty. From another perspective, these stories may also reflect broader cultural anxieties about remote landscapes, places that remain largely outside urban experience. The boreal forest, with its scale and silence, can feel inherently ambiguous to those unfamiliar with it. In such settings, perception becomes more sensitive to suggestion, memory, and expectation. There is also the role of narrative reinforcement. Once a particular motif enters circulation, especially one as visually striking as featureless black eyes, it can be repeated across unrelated accounts, gradually forming a pattern that appears more widespread than its origins might suggest. Over time, the repetition itself becomes part of the phenomenon. And yet, despite these explanations, the stories continue to be told. Not necessarily as claims of certainty, but as experiences shared in a space where interpretation remains open-ended. For some, they are cautionary tales. For others, unexplained encounters. And for many, they exist simply as modern folklore shaped by the intersection of environment, imagination, and cultural framing. In Cree territories today, the boreal forest remains much as it has for generations, vast, intricate, and deeply interconnected. Rivers continue to carve through the land, and wildlife continues to move along ancient patterns of migration. Human presence is woven into this system, but does not define it entirely. It is within this continuity that stories, old and new, take shape. Some are grounded in centuries of tradition. Others emerge more recently, shaped by changing forms of communication and storytelling. All of them reflect, in different ways, how humans interpret presence in environments where certainty is not always immediate. And so the question remains, not as a conclusion, but as a lingering point of reflection within the wider landscape of this exploration. When a figure is seen in the forest whose features cannot be clearly recognized, is it a distortion of perception shaped by light and environment? A narrative constructed through modern storytelling patterns? Or does it reveal something more fundamental about how the human mind responds to vast, quiet spaces where not everything can be easily defined at first glance? As the deep silence of the northern boreal forests settles behind us, the narrative begins to shift once more, away from the cold, shadowed corridors of woodland spirits and into a different kind of landscape. The air grows warmer, the tree line less dense, and the terrain opens gradually into a mosaic of forests, rivers, and rolling plains that stretch across the central regions of North America. It is here, across lands associated with multiple indigenous nations including Cherokee, Lakota, Ojibwe, and others, that a recurring figure appears in oral storytelling traditions, known in many accounts as Deer Woman. Unlike some of the other figures discussed in this broader exploration, Deer Woman does not belong to a single nation's tradition in a uniform way. Instead, variations of her story appear across several indigenous cultures, each with its own emphasis, tone, and moral framework. In some accounts, she is a spirit. In others, a shape-shifting presence. In still others, a cautionary figure woven into teachings about behavior, respect, and consequence. What remains consistent, however, is the setting in which she is often encountered. Deer Woman is most frequently associated with transitional spaces, roads that cut through forest, riverbanks at dusk, edges of settlements, or paths where wilderness and human presence meet. These are not deep wilderness zones in isolation, but liminal spaces, thresholds between worlds where movement and encounter are most likely to occur. Descriptions vary, but many accounts share common elements. She is often said to appear as a woman from a distance, sometimes walking alone or standing still along a roadside or forest edge. As she draws nearer, subtle inconsistencies are noticed, something in the proportions, the stillness of movement, or the way she interacts with her surroundings that feels slightly outside ordinary expectation. In some versions of the story, it is only upon closer observation that her association with deer becomes apparent, whether through the presence of hooves, antler-like features, or a transformation that is perceived rather than fully witnessed. From a cultural perspective, Deer Woman is often understood within a framework of moral teaching. In many indigenous traditions where she appears, she is associated with warnings about behavior, particularly regarding respect, consent, and personal conduct. Her presence in storytelling is frequently linked to consequences that arise from actions that disrupt social or spiritual balance. These narratives are not uniform across all communities, and it is important to recognize that interpretations differ widely. In some traditions, she is described more as a spirit of retribution or correction. In others, she is a warning presence rather than an active force. And in some modern retellings, particularly those outside of indigenous contexts, her character has been simplified or reframed into generalized cryptid or paranormal categories, detached from the cultural teachings in which she originally appears. Historically, deer themselves hold significant symbolic meaning in many indigenous cultures of North America. They are often associated with gentleness, awareness, sensitivity, and the relationship between humans and the natural world. In this sense, a figure that merges human and deer characteristics carries layered symbolic weight, bringing together notions of attraction, vulnerability, and consequence within a single narrative form. Anthropologically, shape-shifting figures are common across many oral traditions globally, and they often serve as narrative mechanisms for expressing complex social and ethical principles. Deer Woman, when viewed through this lens, may be understood not as a literal being to be categorized, but as a storytelling structure that communicates behavioral boundaries and relational awareness. Yet there are aspects of these encounters, as described in modern retellings and oral accounts, that continue to generate curiosity. Some individuals report experiences that do not align neatly with symbolic interpretation alone. Moments of brief, ambiguous encounters on isolated roads or near forest edges, where perception and memory seem to blur. In these accounts, Deer Woman is often described less as a fully observed figure and more as a presence, something seen in fragments, glimpses, or reflections that do not fully resolve into clarity. From a scientific standpoint, such experiences can be examined through well-documented perceptual and psychological mechanisms. Low light conditions at dusk or dawn, combined with motion, fatigue, and environmental ambiguity, can significantly alter visual interpretation. The human brain is particularly adept at recognizing patterns, even when incomplete, and may attempt to fill in missing information using familiar archetypes such as human figures or animal forms. Roadside environments, where many of these encounters are said to occur, are also psychologically unique spaces. They combine motion, isolation, and transitional awareness. Drivers or travelers moving through such areas often experience reduced peripheral attention and heightened focus on forward movement, which can contribute to misinterpretation of fleeting visual stimuli. At the same time, indigenous storytelling traditions emphasize that such figures are not simply seen in the way physical objects are observed. They are often described as being encountered within a relational or experiential context, where meaning is derived not only from visual perception, but also from circumstance, timing, and personal conduct. Within these traditions, Deer Woman functions as part of a broader moral and cultural framework. Her presence in stories is not random, but structured around teaching and reflection. The encounter itself often carries significance beyond the visual moment, extending into interpretation, memory, and consequence. Over time, as these narratives have been shared beyond their original cultural contexts, they have sometimes been reframed in ways that emphasize mystery or fear rather than instruction. This shift reflects a broader pattern in which indigenous oral traditions are reinterpreted through external storytelling genres, particularly those focused on the unexplained or paranormal. In doing so, the cultural specificity of the figure can become less visible, while the more visually striking elements of the story are amplified. Despite these transformations, the figure of Deer Woman continues to appear across multiple regions and communities, each contributing its own variations and emphases. This persistence suggests that the story continues to function as more than just folklore. It remains part of an active narrative system that adapts to context while retaining core themes of awareness, behavior, and consequence. In landscapes where forests meet roads, and where human movement intersects with natural spaces, the conditions that give rise to such encounters remain unchanged. Light still shifts quickly at dusk. Shadows still stretch across pavement and trees. Movement at the edge of vision still invites interpretation. And so the question remains, not as something to be resolved, but as something that continues to move alongside the narrative itself. When a figure appears at the boundary between wilderness and road, seen only briefly and remembered differently by those who pass by, is it simply the mind interpreting uncertainty in transitional light? Or does it reflect a deeper symbolic language through which cultures have long expressed the boundaries between behavior, perception, and the unseen consequences of crossing them? As the figure of Deer Woman fades into the blurred threshold of roads and forest edges, the narrative shifts once again, this time moving north and east, toward a landscape defined not by open highways or plains, but by dense forests, cold lakes, and the long memory of glacial stone. The transition feels almost like entering a different layer of time itself, where landforms are older, heavier, and shaped by forces far beyond human scale. This is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois, whose ancestral homelands stretch across what is now upstate New York and parts of the northeastern woodlands of North America. Here, forests of maple, pine, and oak rise over rocky terrain, and rivers cut through valleys that have carried human presence for thousands of years. BC. Within this landscape, Iroquois oral tradition preserves accounts of beings known as Stonecoats. The Stonecoats are often described in early ethnographic records and indigenous storytelling as powerful, human-like giants whose bodies were encased in thick, stone-like armor or skin. This covering is said to have made them nearly impervious to weapons, fire, and physical harm. In some versions of the stories, they are portrayed as antagonistic figures who once roamed the forests and mountains, posing a threat to human communities. In others, they are more ambiguous, beings whose actions exist outside simple moral categorization. The name Stonecoat itself reflects this defining characteristic, a being covered in stone, or appearing as though their bodies were hardened like rock. In traditional narratives, encounters with Stonecoats often occur in remote forested areas, deep ravines, or near rocky outcrops, places where the land itself already feels dense and enclosed. These settings are not incidental. The northeastern woodlands are characterized by thick vegetation, uneven terrain, and natural formations that can easily obscure visibility and distort perception of distance and scale. Some versions of the stories describe stonecoats as towering figures, significantly larger than ordinary humans, capable of great strength. In these accounts, they are sometimes said to move through forests with heavy, deliberate steps that echo across valleys. Other versions emphasize their resilience, describing them as beings that could not be easily harmed by conventional means. From a historical and anthropological perspective, stonecoat narratives are typically understood as part of a broader mythological framework within Iroquois tradition. These stories often serve multiple functions. They preserve cultural memory, encode environmental knowledge, and express social or moral themes through symbolic figures. In some interpretations, stonecoats may represent metaphorical embodiments of natural forces, particularly the harshness of winter, the immovability of stone, or the dangers of the wilderness. In this reading, their stone skin is not literal armor, but a narrative expression of resistance, endurance, or environmental challenge. At the same time, there are also interpretations that suggest these stories may preserve echoes of historical memory, possibly distorted or transformed over time, relating to encounters with unfamiliar groups, individuals, or even large physical presences within the landscape. Such interpretations remain speculative and are not supported by direct archaeological evidence, but they illustrate how oral traditions can layer meaning across generations. Archaeological research in the northeastern woodlands confirms long-term human habitation, including complex agricultural systems, fortified villages, and extensive trade networks among Haudenosaunee communities. The landscape was not static, but actively shaped by human presence, management, and seasonal movement. Within such a dynamic environment, storytelling often functioned as a way to encode both practical knowledge and cultural values. Stonecoat stories, in this context, may also function as cautionary narratives. In some versions, human characters encounter stonecoats and survive through cleverness, cooperation, or spiritual knowledge. These narratives often emphasize intelligence over brute strength and balance over confrontation. In this sense, the stonecoat is not simply an external threat, but a narrative contrast against which human qualities are defined. Early European observers of Iroquois traditions sometimes recorded these stories through their own interpretive frameworks, often emphasizing the giant aspect while overlooking the cultural and symbolic complexity embedded within the narratives. As a result, later retellings in popular literature occasionally reframed stonecoats as purely monstrous beings, detached from their original cultural context. Yet within Haudenosaunee storytelling traditions, such figures are rarely one-dimensional. They exist within a broader cosmology where beings may represent natural forces, moral lessons, or historical memory simultaneously. The boundaries between literal and symbolic are not always rigidly defined in the way modern analytical categories tend to separate them. From a geological perspective, the northeastern landscape itself may also contribute to the imagery found in these stories. The region is rich in exposed bedrock, glacial erratics, and large stone formations left by retreating ice sheets thousands of years BC. In forested environments, these formations can appear suddenly and dramatically, sometimes resembling figures or shapes when viewed under certain lighting conditions or seasonal changes. It is not difficult to imagine how a landscape filled with towering stone outcrops, shifting shadows, and dense woodland could give rise to narratives involving stone-bodied beings. Yet this environmental explanation does not fully account for the consistency and cultural embedding of stonecoat figures within Iroquois tradition. Within oral storytelling systems, meaning is not confined to physical observation alone. Stories are carried through language, ceremony, and teaching, often preserving layered interpretations that extend beyond surface imagery. The stonecoat, therefore, may operate simultaneously as a narrative being, a symbolic force, and a cultural memory marker. Over time, these stories have continued to be shared, adapted, and reinterpreted. In some modern retellings, Stonecoats appear alongside other indigenous figures in broader compilations of North American mythological beings. In others, they are absorbed into generalized categories of giants or mystery creatures, often separated from their cultural and linguistic origins. This shift highlights an important tension between preservation and reinterpretation, how stories change when moved between cultural contexts, and how meaning can be reshaped when removed from its original framework of understanding. And yet, even as interpretations vary, the image of the Stonecoat persists. A massive figure moving through dense forest, its body seemingly fused with stone, its presence tied to landscapes that are both familiar and difficult to fully traverse. As twilight settles over the northeastern woodlands, and the last light filters through layers of leaves and stone, the environment itself seems to hold on to this ambiguity. Forest and rock remain intertwined, neither fully separate nor fully revealed. And so the question remains, not as something to be answered definitively, but as something that continues to echo within the landscape of memory and story. When a being is described as part human and part stone, moving through forests that have witnessed centuries of change, is it a reflection of literal belief, symbolic teaching, environmental perception, or a deeper way of expressing how landscapes themselves can feel alive with presence, memory, and force beyond immediate understanding? As the memory of the Stonecoat giants fades into the deep, shadowed forests of the northeastern woodlands, the narrative shifts once more toward the far north and west, where the air grows colder, the tree line thins, and the land begins to open into tundra, lake-studded terrain, and long stretches of wind-swept wilderness. It is a landscape where distance feels amplified, and silence is rarely just absence. It is presence without clear origin. In these northern regions, among Inuit and other Arctic and subarctic indigenous cultures, oral traditions preserve a wide range of stories about beings that exist at the edge of human and natural worlds. Among these is the figure commonly referred to in English-language retellings as the Cannibal Owl, or Stikini in some regional variations of Athabascan and neighboring storytelling traditions. It is important to approach this figure carefully, because what is often grouped under a single name actually reflects multiple strands of oral tradition, with variations across communities, languages, and time. In some accounts, the Stikini is described as a human being by day who transforms into an owl-like creature by night. In others, it is a purely supernatural entity associated with harm, misfortune, or taboo transgression. These narratives are not uniform, and their meanings shift depending on cultural and regional context. The imagery associated with the Stikini is striking. In many descriptions, the being is said to shed its human form, removing internal organs or leaving behind a vulnerable physical state, while its transformed owl-like body travels at night in search of sustenance. This detail, while dramatic in modern retellings, functions within the structure of oral storytelling as a symbolic representation of separation between ordinary human existence and states of transformation that violate natural or social boundaries. From a historical and anthropological perspective, stories of the Stikini are often understood within broader frameworks of cautionary narrative. In many indigenous storytelling traditions across North America and beyond, figures associated with cannibalism or transformation frequently serve as moral warnings. They may represent violations of social order, breakdowns of communal trust, or the consequences of actions that place individuals outside the balance of the community. Among Inuit and northern indigenous cultures, owls themselves hold complex symbolic associations. Depending on the specific cultural context, owls may be seen as messengers, observers, or beings connected to the spirit world. Their nocturnal behavior, silent flight, and piercing calls naturally lend themselves to symbolic interpretation, particularly in environments where night can last for extended periods and visibility is limited. In Arctic and subarctic landscapes, environmental conditions also play a significant role in shaping perception. Extended darkness during winter months, combined with extreme cold, wind, and isolation, creates conditions in which sound and movement can be difficult to locate precisely. In such settings, the presence of nocturnal animals, especially silent hunters like owls, can feel amplified within human awareness. Ethnographic records collected during the 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally reference figures resembling the Stikini, though interpretations vary depending on the observer and the community being described. Some early accounts tend to frame these stories through external lenses of folklore classification, sometimes emphasizing the more sensational aspects while overlooking the broader cultural and moral context in which they are embedded. Within indigenous knowledge systems, however, such beings are rarely isolated entities. They exist within networks of meaning that include teachings about behavior, respect for boundaries, and the consequences of disrupting balance within the community or environment. The Stikini, in this sense, is not simply a creature to be categorized, but a narrative presence embedded in a larger system of understanding. From a psychological perspective, transformation narratives, especially those involving dual forms or hidden identities, are widespread across human cultures. They often reflect deep cognitive engagement with themes of trust, hidden intention, and the instability of appearance versus reality. In environments where survival depends heavily on observation and interpretation of subtle cues, such narratives may carry additional weight. At the same time, the physical environment of the North itself cannot be separated from these stories. The Arctic and subarctic regions are among the most visually and acoustically challenging environments on Earth. Snow can obscure landmarks, wind can distort sound, and darkness can last for extended periods. In such conditions, the boundary between perception and interpretation becomes particularly fluid. It is within this intersection of environment, perception, and narrative tradition that stories of the Stikini continue to circulate. In modern retellings, particularly in broader internet folklore communities, the figure is sometimes reinterpreted or generalized, often detached from its specific cultural origins and embedded teachings. This process of reinterpretation can amplify certain features while simplifying others, creating a more uniform but less contextually grounded version of the story. Yet within indigenous storytelling traditions, figures like the Stikini are not static. They are part of living oral systems that adapt to context, audience, and purpose. Their meaning is not fixed in a single definition, but exists across layers of interpretation: symbolic, moral, environmental, and experiential. Even today, in northern regions where winter still brings long nights and vast stretches of quiet land, the conditions that gave rise to such narratives remain unchanged. The same winds move across frozen lakes. The same owls hunt in silence above the tree line. The same darkness settles over the land for months at a time. And so the question remains, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation of inquiry. When a being is described as moving between human and animal form, active in the depths of night within environments shaped by extreme light and silence, is it best understood as a symbolic teaching shaped by cultural worldview, a reflection of perceptual experience under challenging environmental conditions? Or does it also point toward the ways in which human understanding has always sought to describe the unseen boundaries between identity, nature, and transformation itself? As the northern silence of the Stikini traditions fades into the long winter darkness of the Arctic and subarctic world, the narrative begins to shift once again, this time drifting southward along the rugged Pacific Northwest coastline. The landscape changes in character but not in mystery. Here, towering cedar forests meet steep mountain slopes. and ocean fog rolls inland in thick, shifting layers that can obscure entire valleys within moments. This is the coastal world of the Haida, Tsimshian, and other indigenous nations of the northwest coast, where land, forest, and sea are deeply intertwined in both daily life and spiritual understanding. It is a region shaped by rain, tide, and ancient forests, where the boundary between visible and unseen is often softened by weather and terrain. Within this landscape, oral traditions preserved across generations speak of a figure known in English translation as Dzunukwa, often described as the wild woman of the woods. Dzunukwa appears in multiple variations across different Northwest Coast cultures, with names and details differing between communities and languages. In many accounts, she is described as a large, powerful female figure who lives deep within the forest, away from human settlements. She is often associated with thick cedar forests, remote mountain areas, and places where human travel is difficult or rare. Descriptions of her appearance vary, but common elements persist. She is frequently portrayed as large in stature, sometimes towering over humans, with long dark hair and a deeply weathered presence shaped by time and isolation. In some versions of the story, her face is said to be partially obscured or marked in a way that emphasizes her otherness, reinforcing her separation from ordinary human society. One of the most consistent themes in Dzunukwa narratives is her role as both a fearsome and instructive figure. In many stories, she is said to carry a basket on her back, used to capture children who wander too far from safety or fail to respect boundaries set by their families and communities. In other versions, she is more complex, at times dangerous, at times capable of transformation or even generosity depending on the circumstances of the encounter. From a cultural perspective, Dzunukwa is often understood as part of a broader system of teaching stories. Within Northwest Coast indigenous traditions, narrative figures frequently function as moral guides, embodying lessons about respect, behavior, and awareness of the natural world. Dzunukwa's presence in storytelling is often associated with caution, particularly regarding wandering alone into deep forested areas or ignoring communal guidance. At the same time, she is not simply a one-dimensional figure of fear. In some ceremonial contexts and artistic representations, Dzunukwa is also associated with abundance, wealth, and transformation. This duality reflects a broader pattern in Northwest Coast cosmology, where beings often embody multiple, sometimes contradictory qualities at once. Historically, the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest provide a fitting backdrop for such narratives. The region's old-growth cedar and spruce forests are among the most complex temperate ecosystems in the world. Thick undergrowth, limited visibility, and uneven terrain can make navigation challenging even for experienced travelers. In such environments, the sense of being watched or followed can easily emerge from natural conditions such as shifting shadows, animal movement, or wind through dense canopy. Ethnographic records collected during the 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally reference Dzunukwa in the context of oral storytelling shared by indigenous elders and knowledge keepers. However, these records often reflect the interpretive frameworks of outside observers, who sometimes emphasized the more dramatic or sensational aspects of the stories while overlooking their cultural context and instructional purpose. Within indigenous knowledge systems, Dzunukwa is not simply a monster or creature, but part of a structured narrative tradition that encodes lessons about safety, respect, and the consequences of isolation. Her presence in stories is often tied to moments of transition, when individuals move between childhood and adulthood, or between safety and the unknown. From a psychological perspective, figures like Dzunukwa may also reflect the human tendency to personify the unknown aspects of dense natural environments. In forests where visibility is limited and sound can be distorted by terrain, it is natural for the mind to interpret unfamiliar stimuli through recognizable forms. Over time, these interpretations can become embedded within cultural storytelling frameworks, evolving into enduring narrative figures. Yet even with these explanations, Dzunukwa remains a compelling presence within the oral traditions of the Pacific Northwest. Her image continues to appear in carvings, masks, and artistic representations, where she is often depicted with both fearsome and symbolic qualities. These artistic forms suggest that her meaning extends beyond simple categorization, existing instead within a layered system of cultural memory and expression. Modern interpretations sometimes attempt to place Dzunukwa within broader categories of forest spirits or wild women found in global folklore traditions. While comparative mythology can highlight interesting parallels, it can also risk flattening the specific cultural meanings embedded in individual traditions. In Northwest Coast contexts, Dzunukwa is deeply tied to place, language, and teaching systems that resist easy generalization. And so, as the mist continues to drift through cedar branches and the forest floor remains layered in shadow and sound, the presence of Dzunukwa endures, not as a fixed definition, but as a narrative figure shaped by environment, memory, and cultural teaching. And the question remains, not as something to be resolved, but as something that continues to echo through the forests themselves. When a presence is described as both fearsome and instructive, living at the edge of human settlement and deep within the old-growth woods, is it best understood as a symbolic expression of natural caution, a cultural teaching embodied in narrative form, or a reflection of how vast, dense landscapes have always invited humanity to imagine what might exist just beyond clear sight? As the wild woman of the woods recedes into the towering cedar forests of the Pacific Northwest, the narrative shifts once more, this time away from dense inland terrain and back toward the edge where land dissolves into ice, rock, and open Arctic sea. The transition feels like a gradual stripping away of noise. Forest thins, temperature drops, light changes in quality, reflecting off water and ice in ways that seem almost unfamiliar to the southern eye. This is the Arctic coastal world of Inuit regions, where sea ice stretches across vast distances for much of the year, and where the boundary between ocean and land is often seasonal rather than fixed. It is a place shaped by extreme conditions, long periods of darkness, sudden shifts in weather, and a landscape where movement across ice requires deep knowledge of patterns that are both visible and subtle. Within this environment, Inuit oral tradition preserves a figure known as the Qalupalik. The Qalupalik is often described in storytelling as a sea-dwelling being associated with the icy waters near shorelines and the edges of sea ice. In many accounts, it is said to inhabit the transition zone where land meets frozen ocean, places that are visually stable but structurally fragile, where ice can appear solid while concealing shifting water beneath. Descriptions of the Qalupalik vary between communities and storytellers, but common elements appear consistently across many retellings. It is often described as humanoid in shape, with long hair, dark or greenish skin tones, and a distinctive appearance that emphasizes its adaptation to cold water environments. In some versions, it is said to produce a humming or rhythmic sound beneath the ice. In others, it is described as silent, only perceived when already close to the shoreline edge. One of the most frequently repeated elements of the story is its association with the ice's edge, particularly thin or unstable ice near shore. In traditional narratives, children are sometimes warned not to approach these areas alone, as the Qalupalik is said to dwell beneath or near them, waiting in the water below. From a cultural and anthropological perspective, Qalupalik stories are widely understood as part of Inuit teaching traditions. These narratives often serve practical and moral functions at the same time, reinforcing awareness of environmental danger, while also embedding lessons about behavior, safety, and respect for natural boundaries. The Arctic environment itself provides a strong context for the emergence of such stories. Sea ice conditions can be deceptive. What appears solid from a distance may be thin, fractured, or unstable. Cracks can form suddenly, and currents beneath the ice can shift without visible warning. In such conditions, proximity to the ice edge is inherently risky, particularly for children or those unfamiliar with local patterns. In this sense, stories of beings associated with the ice may function as narrative tools that reinforce caution in environments where survival depends on attentiveness to subtle environmental cues. The Qalupalik, as a figure, is often interpreted within this framework, as a personification of danger zones in the ice, especially those that are visually deceptive or unstable. At the same time, Inuit storytelling traditions are not limited to purely functional explanation. They also carry layers of symbolic and relational meaning. Within these narratives, the natural world is not inert, but active and responsive. Ice, water, wind, and animals are all part of an interconnected system in which human behavior must remain aware and respectful. Ethnographic records collected over time have documented variations of Qalupalik stories across different Arctic communities, though it is important to note that these accounts are deeply tied to specific cultural contexts and are not always intended for broad or generalized interpretation. In many cases, such stories are shared in particular settings, with meaning shaped by audience, age, and purpose. From a scientific perspective, the environmental conditions that shape Arctic coastal regions offer multiple factors that could influence perception and storytelling. Sound can travel unusually across ice and water, sometimes creating the impression of movement beneath the surface. Light reflecting off ice can distort depth perception, especially during periods of low sun angle or extended twilight. Wind patterns across open ice fields can produce tonal variations that may be interpreted as vocal or rhythmic sounds. Psychological factors also play a role in how humans interpret uncertain environments. In regions where visibility is limited and conditions can shift rapidly, the mind often relies on pattern recognition to fill gaps in perception. In such contexts, ambiguous sensory input may be interpreted through culturally meaningful frameworks, including narrative figures that embody environmental awareness. Yet even with these explanations, the Qalupalik continues to appear in modern storytelling, artistic representation, and oral transmission. In Inuit communities, these narratives remain part of living tradition, often adapted to contemporary contexts while preserving core themes of safety, awareness, and respect for the land and sea ice. In broader global discussions, the Qalupalik is sometimes grouped into general categories of sea monsters or cryptid-like beings. However, such classifications often fail to capture the cultural specificity and instructional purpose embedded in the original tradition. Within Inuit worldview, the Qalupalik is not simply a creature of fear, but part of a relational system that connects human behavior with environmental awareness. Even today, as climate patterns shift and Arctic ice conditions change, the physical environment that shaped these narratives is also transforming. Ice forms later, breaks earlier, and behaves differently than it did in previous generations. Yet the stories remain, adapting alongside the land and sea they describe. And so the question remains, not as a conclusion but as a continuation of listening. When a presence is described beneath the ice at the edge of a frozen shoreline, moving within a landscape defined by shifting surfaces, sound without clear origin, and light that changes without warning, is it best understood solely as a traditional warning rooted in environmental awareness? Or does it also reflect the deeper ways in which Arctic life has always required attention to what lies just beyond what the eye can safely confirm? As the frozen Arctic shoreline fades into memory, and the Qalupalik stories dissolve beneath shifting ice and water, the narrative begins to move southward once more. The air grows warmer, heavier with humidity, and the landscape transforms into dense hardwood forest, river systems, and rolling hills shaped by centuries of seasonal flood and drought. It is a world defined not by ice and silence, but by deep forest canopy, slow-moving waterways, and the constant presence of life in motion. This is the ancestral homeland of the Choctaw people, whose historical territories once spanned large portions of what is now Mississippi, Alabama, and surrounding regions of the southeastern United States. In this environment, rich with rivers, wetlands, and thick forest cover, oral traditions preserve complex spiritual frameworks that describe the balance between order, chaos, and the unseen forces believed to influence both. Within these traditions appears a figure known as Nalusa Chito, often translated as the Big Night Spirit or Great Evil Being. In Choctaw oral accounts, Nalusa Chito is not described in simplistic terms. Rather than a physical creature in the ordinary sense, it is often understood as a spiritual presence associated with negative influence, mental disturbance, or moral imbalance. In some interpretations recorded by ethnographers and cultural historians, Nalusa Chito is said to enter individuals through the eyes, affecting thoughts and behavior in ways that lead them away from balance and community harmony. These descriptions, however, must be approached with care. They are deeply embedded within a cultural and spiritual system that does not separate psychological, moral, and spiritual experience in the same way modern analytical frameworks often do. From a historical perspective, Choctaw cosmology is part of a broader southeastern indigenous worldview in which the natural and spiritual worlds are interconnected. Rivers, forests, animals, and human communities exist within a shared system of relationships, where imbalance in one area can affect the whole. Nalusa Chito, within this framework, is often interpreted not as a literal entity in the modern sense, but as a representation of harmful forces, whether internal, external, or environmental, that disrupt personal or communal equilibrium. Some interpretations suggest it symbolizes negative thought patterns or destructive impulses, given form through narrative to make abstract experiences more understandable within a storytelling tradition. At the same time, early ethnographic records occasionally present Nalusa Chito in more literalized terms, reflecting the interpretive lens of outside observers who were documenting indigenous traditions during the 18th and 19th centuries. These records sometimes emphasize supernatural aspects while overlooking the broader cultural and philosophical context in which such figures exist. The southeastern landscape itself provides a compelling backdrop for such narratives. Dense forests, swampy lowlands, and winding rivers create environments where visibility can be limited and sound carries in unpredictable ways. In such settings, isolation and sensory ambiguity are natural features of the land. It is not difficult to understand how stories involving unseen presences or influencing forces might emerge within a cultural system closely attuned to environmental observation. From a psychological standpoint, traditions involving entities that influence perception or behavior often reflect a sophisticated awareness of human cognition. Experiences of intrusive thoughts, altered emotional states, or behavioral shifts are universal aspects of human life. In narrative form, these experiences can be externalized into figures like Nalusa Chito, allowing communities to discuss complex internal states through shared symbolic language. However, within Choctaw tradition, such figures are not merely symbolic abstractions. They are part of a lived cosmology in which spiritual forces are considered real aspects of existence, interacting with human life in meaningful ways. This distinction is important, as it reflects a worldview in which the boundaries between physical and spiritual experience are not rigidly defined. In some interpretations, Nalusa Chito is also associated with cautionary teaching. Stories involving this figure often emphasize awareness, moral discipline, and the importance of maintaining balance in thought and action. The presence of such a spirit serves as a reminder of the consequences of imbalance, whether understood spiritually, socially, or psychologically. Modern discussions of Nalusa Chito sometimes attempt to categorize it within broader frameworks of dark spirits or night entities found in global folklore. While comparative analysis can reveal interesting structural similarities across cultures, it can also risk detaching the figure from its specific cultural and linguistic context. In Choctaw tradition, meaning is not isolated in the figure itself, but distributed across the relationships between story, environment, and community understanding. Even today, the landscapes associated with these traditions remain largely unchanged in their fundamental character. Forests still grow thick along riverbanks. Fog still settles over low ground at dawn. Sound still moves unpredictably through dense vegetation. In such environments, the experience of presence, whether visible or unseen, remains shaped by both natural conditions and cultural interpretation. And so the question remains, not as something to be resolved, but as something that continues to echo through the landscape of memory and meaning. When a presence is described as entering the mind, influencing perception, and altering behavior within a world where spiritual and physical reality are deeply interconnected, is it best understood through psychological and environmental frameworks alone? Or does it also reflect a broader way of understanding how human experience has always been shaped by forces that are felt as much as they are seen? As the dense forests of the southeastern woodlands settle into silence behind the stories of Nalusa Chito, the narrative shifts once again, this time remaining within the same landscape, but moving into a different layer of perception. The air is still heavy with humidity, the ground uneven with roots and moss, and the forest canopy filters sunlight into fragmented patterns that shift with every passing breeze. It is within these same Appalachian foothills and surrounding Cherokee homelands, lands stretching across what is now western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and surrounding regions, that another set of oral traditions has long been preserved. These are the stories of the Yunwi Tsunsdi, often translated as the Little People. In Cherokee tradition, the Yunwi Tsunsdi are described as small, human-like beings who live in hidden places within the mountains and forests. Their presence is deeply woven into Cherokee storytelling, where they are not treated as distant mythic figures, but as part of a layered world that includes both visible and unseen communities sharing the same landscape. According to traditional accounts, the Yunwi Tsunsdi are said to inhabit secluded areas such as rock shelters, caves, and remote forested regions, places that are difficult for humans to access or easily overlook. These locations, abundant throughout the Appalachian region, include limestone caves, narrow ravines, and densely wooded slopes where visibility can quickly diminish even in daylight. Descriptions of the Yunwi Tsunsdi vary across different tellings, but they are commonly portrayed as small in stature, yet strong in presence and capability. In some accounts, they are described as benevolent or helpful beings who assist humans in need, particularly those who show respect toward the natural world. In others, they are more cautious figures, capable of mischief or corrective action when boundaries are ignored. One of the most consistent themes in Cherokee narratives involving the Little People is the importance of respect, both for the land and for the unseen forces believed to inhabit it. Stories often emphasize that the Yunwi Tsunsdi are aware of human behavior and may respond accordingly, rewarding respect and awareness while discouraging carelessness or disrespect toward sacred spaces. From a historical and anthropological perspective, these stories are part of a broader Cherokee cosmology in which the world is understood as layered and interconnected. Humans, animals, natural features, and spiritual beings are not strictly separated categories, but participants in a shared system of existence. Within this framework, the Yunwi Tsunsdi occupy a specific relational role within the landscape. The Appalachian region itself provides a compelling physical context for such narratives. It is one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth, shaped over hundreds of millions of years BC through geological processes that created a terrain of ridges, hollows, and hidden valleys. Even today, large portions of the region remain difficult to traverse, with dense forest cover and complex topography that can conceal small spaces and natural shelters. Archaeological evidence confirms long-term Cherokee habitation throughout this region, with settlements often located near rivers, fertile valleys, and defensible terrain. At the same time, oral traditions preserve knowledge of places considered sensitive, significant, or spiritually important, some of which are associated with the presence of the Little People. In some interpretations recorded by ethnographers, the Yunwi Tsunsdi are also connected to teaching narratives involving skill, humility, and respect for knowledge. Stories describe them as highly capable in craftsmanship, healing, and other forms of traditional knowledge. In this sense, they are not merely small beings, but representations of specialized understanding and disciplined practice within the broader cultural framework. From a psychological perspective, narratives involving small or hidden beings often reflect the human experience of perceiving life within complex environments. Dense forests, shifting light, and partially obscured terrain can easily create the impression of movement or presence at the edge of vision. In such settings, the mind naturally interprets ambiguity through familiar narrative forms. Yet, within Cherokee tradition, the Yunwi Tsunsdi are not reduced to perceptual illusion or metaphor alone. They are part of a lived worldview in which multiple forms of existence can occupy the same space without always being equally visible. This understanding reflects a broader cultural approach in which reality is not limited strictly to what is immediately seen, but also includes what is known through relationship, story, and experience. Over time, these stories have been shared across generations, adapting to changing contexts while maintaining core themes of respect, awareness, and the importance of appropriate behavior within the natural world. In many accounts, encounters with the Little People are not framed as random events, but as meaningful experiences tied to place, timing, and conduct. Modern retellings sometimes generalize the Yunwi Tsunsdi into broader categories of forest spirits or hidden folk, found in global folklore traditions. While comparative mythology can highlight interesting parallels, it can also obscure the specific cultural and linguistic frameworks that give these stories their meaning within Cherokee tradition. Even today, the landscapes associated with these narratives remain unchanged in their fundamental character. The Appalachian forests still hold dense thickets, hidden hollows, and quiet spaces where human presence feels intermittent rather than constant. In such environments, the sense that one is not entirely alone can arise not from certainty, but from subtle awareness of complexity in the surrounding world. And so the question remains, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation of reflection. When stories describe a hidden people living within the same mountains and forests as human communities, appearing in places difficult to access and interacting through moments of awareness rather than certainty, is this best understood solely through symbolic interpretation, environmental perception, or does it also reflect a deeper cultural understanding that the world itself may contain layers of presence that are not always visible at first glance? As the story of the Yunwi Tsunsdi fades into the shadowed folds of the Appalachian Mountains, the narrative begins to shift once again, this time moving outward from dense forests and stone-lined hollows into a vastly different world. The land opens, trees thin, the horizon expands until it feels almost unbroken, a wide, sweeping expanse where sky and earth meet in a long, quiet line. This is the Great Plains, a landscape stretching across the heart of North America, covering regions that include present-day Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Nebraska, and beyond. It is a land defined by openness, wind, and distance. Unlike the enclosed forests of earlier sections, Here, visibility can extend for miles, yet subtle movement on the horizon can still be difficult to interpret with certainty. Within this vast terrain, Plains indigenous traditions preserve a wide range of oral narratives that reflect deep relationships with animals, land, and seasonal migration. Among these narratives are references, often fragmented, regionally varied, and interpreted differently depending on source, to beings sometimes described in modern retellings as Otter people. It is important to note that Otter people is not a single, universally defined entity within Plains indigenous traditions. Rather, the term appears in some comparative folklore discussions and loosely connected oral accounts where otters, highly intelligent, semi-aquatic animals found in rivers and waterways across the plains, take on symbolic or transformative roles within storytelling systems. In many indigenous cultures across North America, otters are observed for their agility, playfulness, and close relationship with water systems. Rivers and tributaries in the plains are not merely geographical features. They are lifelines. They structure movement, settlement, hunting patterns, and seasonal cycles. Within this context, animals associated with water often carry layered symbolic significance, representing adaptability, communication, or transitional movement between environments. Some oral traditions describe encounters with beings that appear human-like in certain contexts, but are associated with otter characteristics in others. These accounts vary significantly and are often embedded within broader narrative frameworks that emphasize transformation, respect for water systems, or the consequences of imbalance in behavior toward the natural world. From a historical and anthropological standpoint, it is more common to find references to animal transformation motifs in plains storytelling rather than a distinct, standardized category of otter people. Figures that shift between human and animal form appear widely across indigenous traditions, often serving as narrative tools to express relationships between humans and the natural environment. In the case of otters specifically, their presence in river systems across the plains would have made them familiar and observable to communities for thousands of years. BC. Their behavior, sliding through water, disappearing beneath surfaces, reappearing unexpectedly, naturally lends itself to symbolic interpretation in storytelling traditions that emphasize attentiveness to subtle environmental cues. Rivers in the plains are also dynamic and often unpredictable. Seasonal flooding, shifting channels, and changing water clarity can alter landscapes significantly over time. In such environments, perception itself can become fluid. A brief glimpse of movement along a riverbank, partially obscured by reeds or reflection, might be interpreted differently depending on distance, light, and expectation. Some modern interpretations of otter people narratives attempt to classify them within broader categories of cryptid folklore or shape-shifting entities. However, such classifications often flatten the cultural and ecological specificity of plains storytelling systems. Within indigenous frameworks, stories involving animal-human relationships are rarely about isolated creatures, and more often about relational understanding, how humans exist within, not apart from, the living systems around them. Ethnographic records from plains communities document a rich tradition of storytelling involving animals that serve as guides, tricksters, or moral instructors. While specific otter people narratives are not consistently documented as a standardized category across major plains nations, otters themselves do appear in symbolic and ecological contexts, often associated with water, play, and adaptability. From a psychological perspective, water environments introduce unique perceptual challenges. Reflections on moving surfaces can distort shape recognition, and partially submerged forms can appear ambiguous depending on angle and light conditions. In open landscapes where rivers cut through flat terrain, a single point of movement can draw attention and invite interpretation shaped by cultural narrative frameworks. At the same time, indigenous storytelling traditions emphasize that animals are not merely symbolic representations, but active participants in a relational world. In this sense, any narrative involving otters or otter-associated beings would not be understood as purely metaphorical or purely literal, but as part of a layered system of meaning that integrates observation, experience, and teaching. Across the plains, water systems remain central to life. Even in regions that appear dry or open, rivers and underground water sources structure movement and survival. These waterways have witnessed countless generations of human and animal interaction, shaping both ecological and cultural memory over time. And so the question remains, not as something to be resolved, but as something that continues to drift along the same currents as the rivers themselves. When stories describe beings that move between human and animal forms along the waterways of the Great Plains, are they primarily reflections of environmental perception shaped by riverine landscapes, symbolic expressions of relationship with water systems, or do they reveal a deeper way of understanding how life along these vast river networks has always been defined by movement, transformation, and interconnected presence?